Wow, would you look at all that? Looks like a lot of fun. Okay, to start off with, this video isn't actually for everyone. What the hell, man? Isn't this whole platform for people to install adblock to skip to watching stuff made by— Shh! Okay, if random people like it, good, great, enjoyed the video. But this was kind of made for a specific group of people, the developers of Project Wingman. In particular, I want to provide some good, meaty, creative commentary and constructive critique. Oh boy, okay, here we go with the ego. He thinks he's special just because he likes mecha or jets or has played a bunch of Ace Combat. Well, no, actually. Oh no, here it comes. He thinks he has some special advice just because he listened to himself talk about Ace Combat for like 6 hours in a video series he made. Well, that did get me to notice some good stuff, but that also isn't. Oh, no, right. He's the expert because he practiced art and studied art and design, has worked on a few games, likes science, and knows everything about drawing robots or some shit, or— Ahem. Where was I? Right. Well, the main reason I think I'm in a good position to really, give some good stuff, some good feedback, as some of you may watch or know, over the past year and a half, I've written, directed, stressed out, edited, and generally excreted, and now almost finished, thank God I can't wait to be done, original mecha story. One which also obviously hugely is inspired and is influenced by the same Ace Combat and mecha stories that Project Wingman also was. This project has put me through the ringer, and I feel that the developers of Project Wingman have likely been through something nominally similar. It's a big leap to not just consume, not just review, not even just work with others, but actually put in the really undersold amount of effort to actually make something. So while yes, I have a background in studying art and design, and while yes, I and the devs clearly share a fairly friggin' obvious, passionate love for mecha and Gundam and Ace Combat, what really made me want to talk about this game in this way was I, a crazy person who decided they would build their own robot, looked over the fence and saw a group of crazy people who decided they were going to build their own jet plane. I've struggled to achieve my dream, and in doing so I feel like I'm in a good position to offer some meaty advice and constructive criticism, because, spoiler, I quite enjoyed Project Wingman, and spoiler, I really hope if they decide to make another project, or game, whatever you want to call it, it's even better. So, with that long-winded intro out of the way, let's get down to the deserved bit.
Half a cheer for
Project Wingman.
Hip hip.
So right off the bat, let's get it done. Congratulations, you did it. You had a vision, worked tirelessly day after day, week after week, bit by bit, until one day, you made it. One of my old professors once said, to people who don't make art, making something is a lot like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat. For the people who do actually make art, it's more like being pregnant. A massive project, a big commitment. It takes over a part of your life. It makes you sick with worry. Your ideas start to orbit around it. Your friendships start to be affected. Families start to take notice. Like being pregnant, it's hard with this level of commitment not to constantly be absorbed into it. And for every one finished fan project, every small thing that does happen, there are countless sad, incomplete cul-de-sacs that never make it. The bridge between dream and reality is a brutal and unforgiving one, and like lots of dreams, a lot of folks just don't get there. For every Project Wingman, there is many an at Sky's Edge who don't. So I may be a bit critical at times of this review, on behalf of the few who make it. Prost. Why is it only half a cheer? Well, because for the most part, I won't really fanboy out too much. As a fellow creator of things, I will commend good stuff, but I know how the sausage is made, so to speak. So as that same prof said, the worst advice you can get on a finished work besides it sucks is, it's amazing. Positive congratulations is nice, it makes the effort worthwhile, but it isn't really substantive. Besides, you have a whole Discord server of people who can wake over your game, so I'd be doing a pretty redundant job anyways. As for the rest of the review, I will make use of a
3 dudes in a garage
disclaimer. As I critically come to things that I think could be improved, I will display this and mention this disclaimer. What does it mean? Basically, yes, I am aware that this was a passion project by a small group of people, so some limitations in what could be done have to be taken into account, and what was done should be congratulated. Even compared to a AA studio like Project Aces, who make the Ace Combat games, the Project Wingman team is barely a seventh of their size. This doesn't, I feel, excuse constructive criticism, but hopefully does give some good context. I'm not going to be unduly mean. This isn't a Project Wingman is shit or Project Wingman is amazing video. It's a Project Wingman did manage to get as far as X, but maybe with the points I will talk about, you could get to Y or even Z. And now, for the actual fucking point. Haha, wow! Look at all the orange! Is something tons of people and tons of reviewers have brought up, but without really considering what it means. Now me, I love orange. But while it is glaring, it is also indicative of something larger and one of the main points of the improvements I want to bring up in this first section. Oh, he's gonna say to tone it down. Well, no, not at all. The point of the intense orange is pretty clear. What is the setting? That's right, it's the world on fire. What Project Wingman is doing here is using a creative design like color theory to then influence atmosphere and then influence mood. So the idea of a chaotic world literally torn apart with everything from normal, massive forest fires to fantastical gaping geological wounds, burning cities and smoldering landscapes, it all fits. All of this would be a bit odd thematically without some noticeable red-orange glow. And here, let me award Project Wingman the Spy Kids 3D award of
Why is it that every video game has lava?
An award which zero Ace Combat games have received. For comparison, a hazy, muted, and gray world, like the post-Ulysses Ace Combat 4, channels a very different image of a post-apocalypse. These different colors and their use show a pretty wide diversity of possible tones and emotions, even from nominally similar settings. Now, it would be easy to assume merely toning down the colors would somehow fix the problem, with other folks probably saying, but that won't work as well, and really both are wrong. The use of a controlled color palette can work wonders. Speaking of haze, the movie Heat from 1995 has a primary palette that is almost the polar opposite of Project Wingman. The primary big colors are like blue haze, beige haze, dark blue haze, dark beige haze, normal beige haze, and gray. And this is not a sleeper movie. Heat has some intense action sequences in it, extremely gritty gunfights, so it's not as simple as bright colors bad, muted colors good. It's not even as simple as bright colors action, muted colors sleepy. What matters, as so often is the case, is how you use color theory rather than how brightly the color is used. Now that movie also has a very good quote that I think you can apply as a criticism to Project Wingman.
Don't waste my motherfucking
Graphic design.
And yes, that is what D.Y.W.M.M.F.G.D stands for. Now, Project Wingman devs, you wanted to make a new jet game. A new, specifically, Ace Combat jet game. Not Air Force Delta Strike, not Ubisoft's Tom Clancy's Hawks, not Crimson Skies. Very much a Project Aces-inspired, classic Namco Ace Combat fan game. Now, what is arguably one of the key main ingredients that makes Ace Combat Ace Combat? It's not the jets. It's not the quote anime plots. It's a thing pretty much every Ace Combat game since 3, and even 2 to an extent, has had. The thing that was Kazutoki Kono's background before he became series director. The thing every game since 3, and 2 to a lesser extent, has focused on in fonts, color theory, plane camos, menu design, etc. That's right, my passion. Graphic design. And this, I feel, is arguably an area that a lot of improvements can be made within Project Wingman for sure. Kosuke Itomi, one of the members of Project Aces, commented, for example, in a recent interview how, when I met with various designers and artists outside the company, I often heard them say that they had played AC3, Ace Combat 3. I think that was how much of the impact this title had on them, so the impact is fairly evident. Returning for a moment to the orange! I don't think still that the issue is with the orange itself. If the rest of the game built a solid palette of complementary colors around that intense orange, it would work very well. It would balance such an intense visual. The issue is more so that Project Wingman is very much flooded with very high intensity greens, yellows, pinks, purples, reds, And this goes for the menus, it goes for the missions, it even goes for the plane liveries, or camos, whatever you want to call them. A lot of clashing, vibrant colors mixed with really heavy tones and hues. Vibrancy is overpowering all over. Now I can defend the world on fire for orange or even some good orange red, but this feels more like the world is a rave on acid. This feels like a very cumbersome application of color theory. The in-game lighting of certain levels, as well as being grossly oversaturated with sunsets and certain geological events, has storms, forest fires, and the cockpits being further made out of very bright colors only accentuates this further. When you return to the Ace Combat games, you can see just how conservative and precise they are in comparison. 4 sticks to its blue, 5 its green, and 0 its red. 4 also has, as I mentioned in my review, a primary color simplicity of blue for Mobius / ISAF, red for Aruja, and yellow for, well, Yellow 13, and the Yellow Squadron. Even 3, which conjures images of flashy Y2K architecture, and blue and orange GR and Newcom, has a lot of beiges, grays. The UPEO has a very, very muted robin's egg blue and light beige gray color scheme. So you can see very concise applications here. Now Ace Combat made a lot of use of simple primary opposites in the form of red versus blues. And Project Wingman is not literally only Ace Combat. Both points I think are fair. I don't think Project Wingman 2 or whatever follow-up should be exactly copying AC beat for beat, color for color. And of course, dudes in the garage disclaimer, obviously something like even Ace Combat 3 or 4 had as many people just doing fonts and art direction as the entire team that made Project Wingman and then some. So obviously, you maybe don't have a dedicated guy just working on, fucking kerning. But in general, it's clear, it's concise. If subtle, it's there. Graphic design and color theory has contributed a lot to the sleek identity of Ace Combat. And if Project Wingman took advantage, it would do likewise here. Moving on, another big factor in graphic design is logos. From as far back as the use of Mon Clan logos for the samurai, Japan has had a very big love for minimalist, concise logo use and basically graphic design. Nothing sums this up more, I feel, than the prefecture map of Japan. Every single one has a killer design. They look less like, the very common ugly or cluttered state flags or provincial flags of the US or Canada. They look closer to like sports team logos. They're sharp, they're really, really tight design-wise. And with that cultural precedent, Ace Combat, unsurprisingly, made amazing use of logo design for its factions as well. It's a big part of why you can very quickly tell the fanfiction logos on, certain sites from the game's original ones. For Project Wingman, I will give you Monarch's butterfly also being a crown is very fun and a little clever. But then Crimson's logo is also a red butterfly crown thing as well, which is, weird? Lazy? Yellow 13 didn't use, a yellow inverted Mobius strip. This feels like a missed opportunity for good graphic design, to communicate an antagonist instead of, literally Superman symbol but backwards. This also extends a bit to the factions as well. Already Cascadia and the Federation share, a blue tone kind of thing going on, with a light blue for Cascadia and a dark blue, so there's a bit of similarity. But the logos as well are not super distinctively present in the same way either. Like, yes, I did notice them eventually, and I noticed the Federation's logos on the loading screen for some reason, and the menus, and eventually I played the campaign enough times to make out the flight roundel of Cascadia popping up on, big aircraft and stuff like that, and in the second mission briefing. But it's much rougher of a time to notice the distinction between the two factions, and it really isn't quite as succinct. It's outright lacking from a lot of the briefings, and its lack of presence just doesn't help. The color issue here also adds to this. When you have a lot of vibrant colors occupying the same space, it gets even harder to note subtle differences, like the dark blue, light blue difference between the factions. You got rail guns going off, you got missiles, subtitles in mission, people talking, and so on. And the Independent Forces logo, at least I think that's what it is anyways, also only showing up on aircraft further adds to this kind of messy distinction. It's there, it's been considered a bit, but it's not been considered as much as something like Ace Combat. The limited graphical presentation of the briefings as well plays into this. Don't get me wrong, I know just how tedious and involved making a briefing can be. As someone who never personally memorized NATO symbology, for example, it's a lot of work to get a lot of details right. It's a huge time sink. But it helps clearly communicate something as complex as a massive war. It gives the impression of a massive story scope, gives the players a sense of concrete spatial momentum and location to their battles. It's a huge contribution to both AC's identity and its presentation. A campaign map built out of orange, red, purple, light blue, yellow, and a lot of other stuff has a lot of very vibrant contrasting colors with bright hues and tones competing for visual space. It's really not surprising how, in comparison, since Ace Combat 2 effectively, Ace Combat's art of briefings has only gotten more and more refined. That isn't to say that the briefings are bad. They are, for, the team of this size, disclaimer, very workable and do their job well enough. But visually, it's certainly a point where improvements to get up to Ace Combat's level could be made. As a final thing, how could I not touch on the mechanical design? Now, by and large, most stuff is pretty solid, especially from a small project. The original aircraft variations are fun and dodge licensing issues, and the flying fortresses are great. You have some very fun Gigant-inspired Miyazaki-esque kinda stuff mixed with some Yukikaze Izabuchi Banshee 4 stuff as well. Once more, considering just how much something like plane modeling and asset creation can take up in time, there's a pretty healthy wide roster of designs present, and a lot of stuff has been pretty well done. The surface ships and land battleships as well are simple and Zumwalty, but, they're pretty fun, they're not bad at all. So for a vast majority of stuff, you've got a very good working level of mechanical design. Also, it's funny to see so many LCS-class ships. Truly alternate universes like Project Wingman are the best place for the LCS to be used everywhere, especially where their IRL contracting issues don't pop up. The point I do want to bring up is that of the original superplanes, though. Once more, were it not for the high pedigree of Ace Combat, a lot of these would be fine. If Project Wingman was a tribute to Crimson Skies or Air Force Delta Strike, I wouldn't even be writing this. However, Ace Combat's original mechanical design is superb. It's a series where, when I go back and watch Macross Plus, I have to, re-remind myself that Kawamori's friggin', Kawamori AI Superjet not only doesn't look like the Zoe Falcon, it's not as good as the Zoe Falcon either. When the inspired work surpasses the original in your mind, you know it's something good. Not to mention, of course, that Ace Combat has the full spectrum, beautiful designs from the exotic of Ace Combat 3 to the conventional and advanced Nosferatu. So when it comes to jets, like the actual Project Wingman Mark 1 or the SP-34R, it feels clunky. Okay, fair enough, you don't have the time or resources to animate pop-up missile blocks like PA with AC-6, and the integration still feels rough. These designs feel very art-stationy. You don't have the same sleek elegance of an AC original superplane. Well, okay, maybe like an Ace Combat X superplane, or the Shinden, but not the real sleek stuff. They lack that level of polish. As a small point of note, the Cordium totally not gen drive on the Project Wingman, while very much fitting the World on Fire, kind of works as a neat alternative and a nice touch. The visual of wafting sparks can work on something massive and absolute like a flying wing air battleship, and on a fighter, it's hard to visually beat jet engines for how much they just communicate a raw thrust and power. It's half the reason in science fiction everything from fighters to massive capital ships will have big rooster tail shock diamond forming big flame plumes, jet engines. So, the wafting sparks at high speed and alien nature of the jet is something that works. The color overload of the glowing bits is still in effect though. Balancing for that should still kind of fall in with the main graphic design point. So yeah, once more, dudes in a garage disclaimer, you don't have a dedicated briefing graphic design guide to make some Ghost in the Shell or Patlabor tier amazing interfaces. You don't have a dedicated font guy to make, some new fonts. And you don't have perhaps a dedicated mechanical designer to make a really killer visual design for your superplane. So points for what you got right for sure, but still there's a lot of room for improvement. So I'm not really surprised why these graphical design elements are not as finely done as Ace Combat. It's very understandable. But for Project Wingman 2 or whatever follows, these are some important stuff to focus on improving if you really want to move from just Ace Combat fan project to as good if not better than Ace Combat when it comes to visual design. So, some big points worthy of noting are of course the general game feel, mechanics, and the various different choices Project Wingman made to adjust and play with the formula. I don't think it will be a particularly hot take to say Project Wingman is less some wholly original mechanical take on arcade jet sims, as it is instead a very much reaction to Ace Combat and the genre. The project's raw creation itself being, and I'm guessing here, but I'm pretty sure I'm right, a response to the shift at the time of Project Aces and AC away from Strange Rail as a setting, and the broader decline and disappearance of arcade flight games probably motivated things. A bunch of dudes had something they liked, saw it was generally disappearing, were sad, but then had the time, skills, and willpower to go, hey, well, we can make that, and then they did. So, with that in mind, a comparison and analysis to Ace Combat's design decisions is a good place to start. To begin with the flight model. It's surprisingly pleasant and very smooth. It feels like it would fall somewhere on the line of accessibility versus complexity, kind of somewhere slightly to the left of Ace Combat 4 or 6, without sacrificing so much as to end up very rudimentary as is Ace Combat 7 or 5's case. Combat hits that nice zen of swooping from target to target satisfyingly and smoothly. The gun is very inspired by Ace Combat 6 for certain. It is funny that the time to kill actually isn't that much higher than something like Ace Combat 7, is that the hitboxes of the planes and the relative fire rate and ballistics are just way more favorable. Well, that and the gun sight actually works, that can help a lot. Big thumbs up on both of those points for sure. Moving on to the actual missions, in terms of raw variety mechanically, we get a nice selection and spectrum of combat. I'll deal with story later, so for now, perhaps the most interesting thing to talk about is the special weapons decision. Unlike in Ace Combat, planes can select a wide combo of special weapons to equip to their special weapon slots, with comparative numbers of weapons and, number fired, depending on the size of the pylon slot and where it was selected. This presents to me perhaps one of the most interesting lateral movements Project Wingman makes away from the typical Ace Combat formula. That is to say, while this is a big change, calling it an improvement is a much harder call. It's really more apt to call it a trade. To talk about what I mean, I'm going to use an example from Ace Combat 4 and Ace Combat 6, using 4 as a baseline and touching on 6 later as an example of scale. In Ace Combat 4, you attack Wrigley Air Force Base. I think it's around mission 2 or 3, something like that. Now, this mission presents a mix of a few air targets and a few base defenses, so planes on the ground you can hit with missiles or bombs. Obviously here, multiple gameplay styles opt for different advantages. Attackers will carry more but maneuver worse against air targets while being able to hit ground targets better. This will let you kind of handily take care of the airbase while relying on your normal missiles to deal with air targets. Alternatively, you could take a plane with good or great air-to-air missiles, which you can still fire at the planes on the ground for reasons, but not at the ground targets. So you will have to rely on guns or normal missiles to take them out. This is the interceptor or air superiority approach of gameplay. As a final option, you could take a high-end plane with very devastating air-to-ground weapons, or a more hybrid plane with wider options. So, establishing by default, we can see, depending on the mission, you had at least 3 distinctive playstyles, with possibly more depending on how detailed you want to get. In Project Wingman's third mission, we also carry out a similar airbase attack. However, the multi-special weapon setup allows you to essentially carry out all 3 options at the same time. So what we are trading here essentially is a specialist gameplay loop for a more generalist gameplay loop. This will sound astoundingly obvious for those familiar with these details. However, the thing I noticed is that the interestingly massive impact they had on replayability. You see, a prime motive for replaying any game is the variability of making new, different choices, right? Well, that or not sucking ass. So, in Ace Combat 4's example, we can see how, even with a very mundane early mission, you kind of get a sense of at least 3 times the mission's length of gameplay that we get out of it, if not more, thanks to that variability, thanks to that more specialist approach. Now when you combine that with, the scoring system, we see twin motivations for the player. So, replay the mission to get better, but also try replaying the mission a different way. Wait, hold on. Scoring system. Oh no, Gromit! We forgot the scoring system and timer! And bingo. There you go. A huge blow is done to replayability as well, thanks for the loss of these other 2 systems. Specialist special weapons alongside with, yes, a lack of timer and a lack of score count. While it's easy to be annoyed at these limitations are essential motivations for the player. Without Mario getting, fucking killed by jumping into a hole, the player has no motive to avoid that obstacle. With no timer, the player has no pressure to hit targets efficiently. With no score, okay, yes, I know you still have, a kill counter at the end of the mission, and that impacts how much cash you have to buy planes, but you know what I mean, no shiny, special S rank. The player loses another prime motivator for honing their skill. While it's true kills still contribute to cost, with no real kill grade and no penalty for dying or using ammo or damage, you effectively lost a very meaty sense of consequence. It has a far more limited impact. This was already something of an odd thing in Ace Combat, and while it had, mercenaries, it never really went back to the full Area 88 roots something like Ace Combat 1 or 2 had, with stuff like Wingman affecting for mission payout, for example. For Project Wingman, a game squarely centered heavily in plot and narrative around mercenary air forces and, mercenary air force characters, this same lack of impact, of mechanical consequence, it makes it even weirder. When your AWACS has, multiple in-mission lines about earning and losing fortunes many times over, it would have been interesting to have a gameplay loop which, impactfully, through consequence, really made allusion to that. Really had the player go, yeah, I did screw up, and it crashed, and I lost a lot of money. Oh no. Now, while that is present in Conquest mode, campaign is where, the narrative weight of that impact would have taken place. Even if we say the motivation of purchasing planes is still there, which it is, the total units destroyed doesn't have the same skill gate, because with no timer, the player has no real difficulty in managing targets within a mission. And without a gradient score rating, something like an S rank bonus, kind of lacks the same impact. And with, that's right, no specific special weapons, the player loses the kinds of raw replay motivation to really approach missions to such a new degree. It is interesting, it is something Project Aces with Ace Combat have had, kind of held true for almost 30 years in comparison. While it is true hybrid special weapons can be mixed around at different degrees, the freedom of choice here makes it less of a, do you want a hot dog, fried chicken, or a pizza, and kind of more of, do you want a chicken burger, a chicken salad, or a chicken cone? This isn't to say, to make it sound like this system is bad. It really isn't. But it isn't obviously superior so much as an alternative to the usual Ace Combat formula. Now, of course, fans will be impressed, players will be impressed, hey, there's no consequence. If you were to actually do a survey, I would wonder how many of these same people replayed this game as much as something like Ace Combat 4. Now, remember when I said I would also mention Ace Combat 6? Oh, I see Argynbald. He's going to mention how Project Wingman's mission scale is large, like Ace Combat 6. Hence the hybrid generalist approach to... Ace Combat 6 wasn't generalist, actually. What? Yeah, Ace Combat 6's small plane roster meant each plane was kind of very specialist in performance, and its special weapons even more so, with volley size, type, and damage being even more specific. But Project Wingman has volley size, right? Oh, yeah, it does, but the generalist approach to special weapons isn't something 6 had. To put simply, 6, you could really double down on specialist special weapons because it had the allied attack system in place. With allies who can cover your weaknesses, players were allowed even more specialization. You can see this pretty clearly in the missions, where there's often, a free air-to-air option, cut somewhere on the side of the level someplace. The player could choose a mud hen with a buttload of bombs, or they could choose a pure air-to-air Sukhoi, because the player-friendly units could be masked with allied attack and wingman commands to fill the gap, so to speak. So while something like generalist special weapons as an option is more of a lateral move, I will say the lack of an allied attack system, or even just wingman commands, is, Project Wingman, it's detrimental to the kind of larger combat sandbox you have, where the scale is still definitely present, it's still big, but it's lacking that. As another factor, the general homogeneity of special weapons here also impacts kind of similarly. Multi-lock air-to-air and multi-lock air-to-ground missiles are just way too good and way too useful. Outside of a few missions that might incentivize something like semi-active homing missiles, for example, a lot of these just don't, pun intended, stack up. The bomb's ammo count and blast range are also not super competitive given the scale, unlike the fucking flatteningly large explosions in something like 6. Even the super weapons like the railgun and burst missiles are mostly super, because they're even more generalist and utilitarian, not specific. And if you're wondering, I rate the burst missiles above Ace Combat 7's 80mm, but slightly below AC6's 80mm, on my Itano missile spamometer. Mostly edged out for a slightly less satisfying launch animation, no pop-up animation, but with good points for launch noise, missile amount, and FPS loss. One place where the relatively weak special weapons trend is inverted is the gun pods. Thank you for the gun pods. They don't always sound amazing, but mechanically, they are very fun and very good. The idea of a superplane in particular whose entire deal is ballistic weapons was a great one. It's kind of funny, this is a super weapon category and just special weapon category that Ace Combat has unfortunately ignored for quite a while. Here, I feel the combination of mission scale, hitboxes, muzzle velocity, and damage mesh very well to make pretty much everything but the shotgun gun pod feel very fun and rewarding. On the note of that plane selection in Ace Combat 6, it's really also very impacted by this. While the wide variety of planes might impress the layman, the lean towards generalist gameplay mechanically means unfortunately a lot of these really lack any personality. Hands down, some of the most optimal planes are the high-end ones with the highest slot and volley size for special weapons payloads. The stall MTD here manages to outcompete the Superjets because of just how many slots and weapons it has available. AC6 had the opposite setup, where a narrow amount of specialist planes with wide special weapon choices, but single special weapon selection, highly incentivized replayability mechanically. Also, obviously, without score and timer elements, multi-special weapon loadouts and return lines don't really have a place existing within Project Wingman's gameplay sandbox at the same time. Whew, that was a lot of technical game jargon. So basically, to sum it up, if you want Ace Combat, but also want big missions, but also no timer, but also no score, be prepared to lose a lot of incentive for players to spend more time replaying missions with alternative playstyles and improving skill level. And if you lack Wingman or allied unit commands, the player has less freedom to account for specialist gameplay choices, as their allied units can't be commanded to fill that gap. This is especially a big deal on big missions with tons of mixed unit types. People often complained AC6 was sloggy, but I don't think I ever actually felt that until I played Project Wingman, where the lack of allied support made me really feel it for the first time. And if the multi-special weapon selection as well leans very much to a generalist approach, prepare to lose even more incentive for replayability. This is something that's a big deal when your primary game consists so much of a single-player campaign as its main, content. So, you've sacrificed limitation for freedom in this trade-off, but lost replayability in the process. Now the Wingman stuff you could chalk up to, of course, disclaimer, but the special weapon design and score timer loss feel very much like concise choices. So overall, very fun gameplay, but some stuff to consider. Moving along. Both are good. Visually, it's quite impressive just how much a small team using Unreal managed to achieve. Now, performance-wise, it heats up my GPU like a bitch, and, certain unit destructions occasionally cause frame drops, some Unreal TM pop-ins, some occasional cloud glitches, but the devs probably know about, most of these already. Also, if you do this, it lags a lot, but I think why should be fairly self-explanatory, and I don't consider this an issue. So, generally, great visual design here, weapons look great, contrails look fantastic, and you guys even managed to pitch, get that pressure stuff in there and some sonic booms, so big thumbs up. For such a team, I think necessity was the mother of invention and limitation the daddy of good application here. You guys got it to a really solid level where it can compete with Ace Combat with a fraction of the manpower used in the process. This kind of shows just how far Unreal and the right mindset can take you. Maybe the funniest thing to me is just how long Project Aces spent working on so many minutiae of clouds, lighting, acoustics. For a team many times the size, they probably could have finished, Ace Combat 7 much sooner had they not been stuck in a development hell because of all this stuff. It largely felt like waste, especially when Ace Combat 7's story was kind of terrible and the flight model was crap in the campaign, Hey, at least it's great for those clickbait national interest articles, I guess. Now, audio design here is also quite solid. The weapons, ignore the gun pods, in general, have nice impact and appropriate sound. Jets are loud, impacts reverb quite a good deal. There's some suitable low octave resonance going on to a lot of explosions, satisfying weapon swapping noises, all good stuff. Oh, and the soundtrack is good. As someone who got literally into episode 1 of my series and went, hey, hold on, I think I need original music. Shit. I'm well aware of the hurdles of getting a composer you can then work with and how challenging it can be sometimes, I understand. Overall though, there's no complaints. Some real standout tracks. The ones in Sirens of Defeat is tonally good. There's the really exciting one in Cold War. There's some just really good stuff all over. As far as it stacks up to Ace Combat, it's tough. I don't feel it's quite as strong as the real peaks of Ace Combat's OSTs, but at the same time, yep, disclaimer,
3 dudes in a garage.
AC at its peak had no less than 4 composers. Yes, the same as Project Wingman's entire dev team doing music. Even whittled down just to Keiki Kobayashi, it's a real powerhouse to contest with. So, yeah, as far as Project Wingman goes on its own, the music is fine, it works, has some nice melodies, and once in a while has some real standout moments. Jose Pavili here really acoustically, much like the rest of the team visually, is clearly punching well above his weight. I think the real rough area for audio is maybe some of the voice lines. Now Ace Combat has always had some awkward moments here and there, got some jank, but I think a lot of that added to the charm. Another thing to consider is that English being a secondary language meant most of that awkwardness comes from the language barrier and then the translation barrier subsequently. Interestingly, Ace Combat 4 only had an English voice cast, so in Japan, the JASDF was basically entirely reformed according to American standards, so the association of English as the military flight language also adds to this. With Project Wingman, however, as an English-first project from Australia, it doesn't have quite the same approach. Here, the subtitles occasionally mismatching isn't really that much of an issue, and God knows I've made enough syntax and spelling mistakes in my own series, so, No, the real thing I think really I picked up on as being rough was mainly some of the deliveries. Now, from what I remember and what is kind of obvious, they pulled people from kind of all over voice acting talents in terms of, experience range. From folks with dozens of credits to people with basically just 1 or 2. Working with voice acting is something I have learned a lot about working on The Revenge of Mecha. It isn't easy. Writing, delivery, recording, editing lines. What you write isn't always what multiple different people can comfortably read. Line delivery is a really subtle art, recording can be hampered by technical issues, etc. The standout performance I think goes to the relatively green VA, Haven Kendrick, as Assassin. Or maybe it's Heaven? Whatever. Anyway, the mercenary leader Franken. He really nails a great sense of enthusiasm and grandeur for a PMC leader with big ideals. Kyle Kriebel as AWACS Galaxy does a very solid job with the amount of lines given. Ben Balmaceda as Diplomat also has, 1 or 2 awkward deliveries, but is otherwise very solid. I think the 2 roughest spots are with Mikkel Dover's performance as Comic and Eric Thomas Stanley as Briefer. Yes, literally that's his name. Stanley's performance is mostly fine, but due to the volume of lines you get, it's, the briefing guy, you start to notice some real stiffness. It's not a lisp, it's a real jaw tightness that causes a certain amount of eshes to start kind of like a shh a bit. I apologize in advance if he was like Kanye and threw the wire, and he broke his jaw mountain biking, but, a more relaxed, flexible lower delivery would have helped make those stiffnesses kind of go away somewhat. Dover's Comic instead has less of a specific issue and more of a general weirdness with the delivery. There's a very flippant sort of, I don't know how to put it, bordering on annoyed Valley Girl delivery for a lot of her lines. Something feels off about it. I can't say it's one thing in particular. In comparison, Madeline Doro's delivery as the Wuzzo Prez feels way more natural and doesn't have the same issue. Also, the inclusion of a voiced Wuzzo is pretty neat. It's a cool detail. Some people seem to really go a bit overboard for this character. I think they probably haven't kissed a girl. Other than those few, though, most of the other lines or voice actors are either nice and solid, or if they have issues, are not really prevalent enough to be a problem. So, if I didn't mention them in particular, don't assume they weren't good enough or bad, just think they worked. Now, let's get to the story. For this last main section, I want to break down Project Wingman's story. It's going to be tough. Before we get to that directly, we need to establish some context, which is easy to gloss over, but is important for giving us a good breakdown of Project Wingman's approach, effects, and probably some of the issues. A. It should be obvious that Project Wingman and Sector D2 as a team, when it comes to story, is more ambitious in roughly the same time, but with less titles as Project Aces was with Ace Combat. Now what the hell did I mean by that? Well, basically, even if we conservatively narrow down Ace Combat's progression of narrative development just to Ace Combat 1, 2, and 3, we can see it took Project Aces right from the release of Air Combat in 1993 all the way to Ace Combat 3 in 1999, 3 releases and a slow ramp-up of inclusion of narrative for story to play a big part. To say nothing of the PS2's even more ambitious ramp-up. In essence, due to the shifty nature of just what a game was, in those 6 years, the mid to late 90s, a massive shift in the inclusion of narrative occurred. Games went from essentially arcade ports of, home consoles, and from simple bare-bones frameworks of, you are Pac-Man, you eat balls, all the way to Metal Gear Solid's,
the military secretly injected soldiers with the soldier gene.
Yeah, that. Over this period, Ace Combat likewise went from an arcade port to a sprawling multi-thread narrative work. It went from just, wow, Top Gun sure is cool, to one of the most interesting takes on cyberpunk in video games. So why the hell do I mention this? Well, because it's a big difference. Project Wingman began its development 20 years after Ace Combat 1 was released on the PS1 in 2015. The modern standard of narrative in games, both in depth, execution, and quality, has become not just normalized, but arguably on par, or in some cases better, than movies, books, and television. So why is this important for our rating of Project Wingman and its narrative? Because, as I said, it's clear Project Wingman isn't slowly ramping up its narrative. It is cannonball diving into the deep end of narrative implementation, skipping over the more, modest, simpler versions of stories like something like Ace Combat 4 might have used. By the time Ace Combat Zero's level of now fan-favorite narrative was implemented, it had no less than 2 primary writers, a 3rd writer, all the people who wrote mission dialogue, another 3 games to work it out, etc., etc., etc. Project Wingman has at least 1 main writer, and has going, straight to Zero's level of narrative scale in 1 game. In a word, Project Wingman's story is ambitious. I know this because I dove into a slightly different pool, also ambitiously, albeit maybe with more of a belly flop. Writing episode by episode Revenge of Mecha has been very challenging, and I've no doubt writing and finishing each mission was also quite challenging. But ambition, much like diving into deep-end pools from a high diving board, is really only as impressive, or painful, as the quality of your execution. And here is the other important thing. B. It's readily apparent some stuff like in-engine or pre-rendered cutscenes weren't gonna make it, and they weren't a priority. This I feel was fair. Game studios usually have a totally separate production pipeline set up for cutscenes, entirely because it takes them just so fucking long to do. Ace Combat 7's cutscenes visibly couldn't keep up with its narrative whiplash of the disjointed production. We can see that, kind of as an audience, bluntly in a few cutscenes themselves. So when, of course, disclaimer,
3 dudes in a garage.
you don't have the resources, here I feel it's important to mention that given a modest level of presentation, a la Ace Combat 4's cutscenes, something would have been manageable with the right approach that you don't necessarily have to have fancy pre-rendered visuals. But it clearly wasn't something the team wanted. It was a conscious decision and a resource one not to include them, and that impact, I think, did affect the execution of Project Wingman's narrative. So, I feel these 2 factors give us a good starting context for reading through that narrative. A. Boys be ambitious! Project Wingman wanted to tell a full-sized, big, and meaty story, not something more limited like Ace Combat 2 or Ace Combat 4. And B. Cutscenes, Janai! We can see a reasonable mix of the team doesn't have the resources or manpower combined with this wasn't a core creative priority when it comes to the decision not to include cutscenes of any kind. So, with that in mind, let's move on through the campaign, looking mission by mission, what did they do, did they work, and so on. Now, right away, as one final aside, we do have a fairly extensive lore dump in the files included in the game. These can provide great context, much like Ace Combat Zero's or 6's assault records, but I'm generally, wow, no way, giving higher priority to campaign narrative over archive lore, because the campaign's narrative is the one actually integrated into the core gameplay experience. Maybe if this was Dark Souls and the only context possible was gleaned from the original Greaser Bob's bearskin, boots, and can opener, we would have, a higher priority to archival stuff, but it isn't. Oh, and this isn't going to be a summary either. Wikipedia can do that job. This is going to be talking about what works and what doesn't. So, right off the bat, a brief introduction sets up the setting and world. There's some fun allusions to Sunrise's 1996 after-war Gundam X, and in general, a bunch of Gundam and mecha tropes are at play. It's a post-apocalyptic world with a new calendar, new power systems, and a new super technology and materials. Mission 1 really does a lot of heavy lifting for the big picture in terms of setting the stage. We're introduced through combat to a world that has recovered, albeit misshapenly, from the cataclysmic event that set it up. We have massive political blocks surrounded by still recovering periphery nation-states, huge mercenary armies are in play all over. This mission and its briefings also introduce us to the core cast. Comic and Diplomat make up our squad's traditional Ace Combat roles. Kaiser is the leader of Sicario, the mercenary group, and Galaxy is our AWACS to fill out the traditional Ace Combat cast. On the larger plot, this mission also sets up something nasty and very WMD-ish being worked on by the larger powers. All in all, quite solid. The following two missions then go on to set up our core conflict. We have a very classic American story. Cascadia, a nation formerly within the antagonistic Federation, is seeking to claim its independence. It lacks the required local forces, and so Sicario's mercenaries are signed up. It's a fun and very solid basis for a plot, with a lot of ambition. It's not a story that's been done by Ace Combat, and while a lot of the elements have been, used before in Mecha and in that series, there's some fairly great remixing going on that I really do enjoy. In particular, the clever inclusion of bounty hunters as an excuse for tack names. In real life, pilots have, several layers of names and call signs and tack names anointed on them depending on mission and squadron and so on. They here just have a shortcut. If your real name gets out, bounty hunters will come after you. It's very fun. Realistically, would any bounty hunter have the resources to hunt down a member of a private military like the size of Sicario? Maybe not. But it's a creative choice, so I don't really take issue. It keeps characters to a primary names, and it keeps the writing efficient. Mission 3 here also puts a fun twist on the classic early game airbase assault mission of Ace Combat, and letting it be the objective for the base of Sicario to operate out of. I like this because these first three missions carry through on this vital, wider level of mission-to-mission pacing that is critical to good, flow for an Ace Combat narrative. With Mission 4, we start to get some good hints about Hitman Squadron's backgrounds as being natives to Cascadia, and this being less of a grand adventure and more of a return home. Overall, it's, got some nice mixed air and ground missions that continue the pacing. The inclusion of castles and the rolling vineyard-laden hills is great. Combining with the mercenary armies, it brings a very medieval aesthetic, one that Ace Combat Zero used symbolically for its approaches to war, but here becomes more of a literal illusion in setting. I do feel here I should bring up just how weird it is to write Ace Combat-style stories. You really get a very weird distribution of what kinds of information you can tell. Big levels with lots of moment-to-moment distributions, but then get very crowded by, gameplay distractions, and then really just a short briefing and after-mission report. So far, the pacing is keeping up well. Mission 5 gives us something more rarely in Ace Combat. Most of these games are climactic involvement in the war, harkens a pivotal turning point, where after huge losses, ISAF or other teams start to gain a strategic advantage, Clausewitz style, to gain momentum. Ace Combat 5 has its initial Harbor Cap mission with great losses, but it's really Ace Combat 6 that has the same DNA here. We are presented Presidia, in much the same way Grace Maria is presented in 6. This is our pivotal objective we will hopefully, one day, fight back to reclaim. The inclusion is a good one, as we also get a fun mechanical, do not go here unless you want a fight zone on the map. Without score and timer, it was really one of the rare elements like this in the Crimson fight in Mission 6 that truly drew me to replay, because there was a path unwalked mechanically. I wish more were present across the campaign's further missions. Mission 6 introduces another classic mecha trope, the new Special Unobtainium. Code Geass's Sakuradite, Gundam's Lunar Titanium, Wing's Gundamium, Alloy, or M.F.G.D fusion reactors. Here, I think the funnest idea in play is really the idea that the Tectonic Calamity also made this resource available. It seems fantastical, but it really wasn't that long ago that uranium was mainly valued for a nice yellow tint it could give to diningware. Some incredible resources are the ones we initially ignored. Sunlight and solar through hydro and wind and renewables are now the stuff that everyone talks about, and even gasoline was once thought of merely as a wasteful byproduct of trying to make that more useful lantern oil kerosene. The additions of these kinds of super materials and their technology is a solid story and world-building tool for selling fantastically massive airships and superplanes. It helps ground them in a bit of realism. This mission's pacing-wise also continued good momentum and takes a page from Ace Combat 4 in the attack on the enemy's resource facilities. Like Lifeline from that game, it also features the first in-gameplay introduction from what initially seems to be our main antagonist, Crimson 1. True to style, you can engage and shoot one down, or flee as the more plot-friendly option. Overall, though, still very solid. 7 has a classic Ace Combat-style big naval strike. Now here I can say Project Wingman doesn't terribly innovate all that much mechanically. Boats here, like in many Ace Combats, are essentially just slow-moving target clusters that take a pass or two if you don't keep bombs or anti-ship missiles on hand. Is it not fun, Argon Bolt? No, it's very good, especially with the gun, but it doesn't do much new. Especially if, like you got used to the reassuring confidence of AC-6's "This is the Miracle" and its ECM. There's the inclusion there of a central ship that had mechanical ramifications that helped really solidify the vessel as a member of the cast. Mechanics aside, the Eminent Domain, fun name, does provide some good writing and voice acting that makes it still an enjoyable mission. The real standout might actually just be the weather. God, how long did they struggle with Ace Combat 7's clouds, when this level of presentation is perfectly fine and much less painful. Anyway, I digress. Also, for cruise, missile, you do some shadowing. The continuation of Ace Combat with a fun twist carries through again here. Militarily, the plot excuse of penetrate airspace and shoot down supply planes meshes fantastically with do so in front of civilians to expose war effort and media blackout. It's a great use of internal logic and world building, having the massive flying airships also have civilian application and models. It's just plain cool. Character-wise, it also gives some more time for Diplomat to develop as a wingman character, so in all, pretty good. We get a fun solo sneaking mission. It also checks off our fly-through tunnel Ace Combat box, some great atmosphere both visually and musically from the OST. Here's a good time to mention as well the concise build-up to the strike on the communication facility. I mentioned in my Ace Combat 4 video how part of the Strength of Force campaign really is the overarching arcs that game has. Building to Yellow, building to Stonehenge. Even though the Solana communications array isn't a big superweapon in the traditional Ace Combat sense, it has been foreshadowed as far back as missions 2 and 3. So we get a very solid build-up here. As well, this mission physically serves as us cleaning an air corridor of long-range SAMs to prime for that attack. Some solid little character moments, good pacing, good stuff. Mission 10's then our all-out big attack. It's a nice mixed bag of targets, it has elements of Whiskey Corridor's setting without the drudgery of the length of that mission. The slow staging of the assault is great. Once again, I do have to applaud the wider plot here and the use of what Solana is. While a big laser tower or a big railgun cluster is certainly very cool, I like the subtlety of Solana. It's clear that the campaign's progression, that from little we have seen of the Federation's tenure as its control over Cascadia, was very much about power projection. In that, big infrastructure projects serve a massive role. Financing a huge communication relay that could also double as a jamming and ECM center should your vassal state rebel is really, really smart and a really fun setup. Countries like China, with its Belt and Road Initiative, will spend millions on mostly unprofitable train lines, airports, all as just a means of projecting power outwards via communication and the shortening of distances via cheaper, faster transport. So sure, it doesn't have the climax of big fucking gun, but it's smart, and I like and appreciate that. Character-wise, we also have some fun stuff with Sicario's ground forces in action. It shows the scale of the mercenary armies like Sicario have in this world, all good. Now Mission 11 might hands down be the best mission in the game. Maybe the strongest level, in just so much. Cold War's plot of a reasoning based on a snowball effect of a furball drawing in more and more fighters is not just a good one, it's a great one. militarily this is a hell of a good excuse for an absolutely terrifying and excessive loss in manpower and machinery. Does it have the central rocket launch of Kimona? No. Does it need it? Maybe not. The mechanical satisfaction of getting sucked up into this big air fight in the sky within the flight model is exactly what Yukikaze's opening battle made me want to play over 10 years ago. Crimson's arrival here and engagement feels all the more better militarily and certainly stands on par with Yellow's arrival in AC4. We basically get a very solid pacing and characterization and plot movement through this whole deal. We also get some nice meaty hints about the war in Oceania, which preceded the game's events, and possible hints about Monarch. Mission 12 gave us, some more nice character moments, and provides us with a fun mid-campaign boss. I think once again the atmosphere and visuals and OST are very strong. Now as for Frost herself, I'm not going to detail just yet, as I have a larger point relating to her to get to. Generally speaking, solid mission. The super attack on Mega Pearl Harbor is fantastic. Easily, very early on, not counting the optional Fleet of Presidia, there is a very distinctive missing of the big fleet action mission, which most Ace combats have, the attack on the port or the harbor. The fact that the attack takes place at the Federation's massive airship dockyard is fantastic. Some big stuff I want to really compliment here. Giant planes in our world have a long history with semi-aquatic design. Their raw size meant that dedicated runways were a pain, but any harbor with, clear enough surface conditions could work. The legendary Spruce Goose being perhaps still one of the most notable, though not to undersell others like the beautiful PBY Catalina or the Martin JRM Mars. The other aspect of a, mirrored sense of power projection, of Asia using not Hawaii, is, fantastic world building and good use of plot. More specifically, this mission has a rather heartfelt callback. It speaks of the Oceanian War that was, headed by the mercenary lords as the previous major conflict and setting. But beyond that, once again, great world building, it's emotionally a callback to Ace Combat players and their experiences of decades past. It's a nice touch. It builds some suggested mystery behind Monarch's background and characterization. Overall, the number of targets is massive, but the novelty of the setting and the target type really does make it quite fun. Perhaps the best visual and emotional expression of the world on fire, and the last I'll talk about in this first half of the story sections, is 14's literal massive forest fire. While not as climactic as Mission 13, it acts pacing-wise as a good filler mission. Not so much to pad out the game, but to provide some good kind of repose for the player, some quieter time. At this point, the war feels catastrophically in favor of Cascadia, thanks to the player's actions. But much like AC0's The Final Overture, you can simply tell this isn't going to be quite that easy. However, from here on out, the final 6 missions do somewhat go off the rails, and I think you'll see why I felt that was so important to mention A and B early on. The final 6 missions of the game, I feel, are really where the ambition starts to backfire, and the tight execution of that ambition begins to break down. The massive siege on Prospero ends, well, in quite cataclysmic a fashion. The player can find some abandoned airships, and it's heavily hinted by the plot that their cordium has been placed as, well, a powder keg. For what? The giant initially inactive volcano, the foreshadowed bomb from Mission 1, and the cruise missiles from Mission 7, to be the match that sets it off. Many of our allied units are destroyed, and devastation is unleashed. Now for some folks, this probably seems very impressive, but pun intended, I feel it lacked a lot of impact. To explain why, I think I can be confident in using Mobile Suit Gundam as a point of comparison. You see, in this game, that is the first game, of which we see a window into this world and setting, we don't get a particularly vulnerable view. Now what do I mean by that? Well, we simply don't get a perspective where the devastation unleashed is really actually that impactful. We have seen this entire world, a world rife with mercenaries, corrupt federations, and megacorporations, largely through the very literal bird's eye view of a pilot simply flying over it all. We have destroyed just army after army quite a bit, and now we haven't even really seen any points of emotional attachment. Here we can look at 0079. In that first Gundam, we see a pretty crazy, out there, zany space war. Battles take place around Space Colony, war machines are giant rainbow robot suits, Sydney gets boogie blasted before the show even starts. But what 0079 does quite a lot of is establish human points of contact with the plot through characters. The crew comprising of civilians is just a start. We have old people and children, various people fleeing on the white base. 0079 time and time again shows us not just cool Shar Aznable or desperate fighting Amuro, it shows us a civilian perspective. In the episode where some survivors casually remark, "Hey, that town don't exist anymore. That lake? Yeah, that's where the town was." We get this nice vulnerable viewpoint of normal people that have just had to tolerate and survive, and it hits very hard. Ace Combat has made use of this quite a lot as well. Ace Combat 3 had its news bulletins very grimly remark on civilian deaths. Ace Combat 4 literally has an entire side plot about a young boy taken right from 0080, The War in the Pocket, specifically to contrast Mobius's heroics with a vulnerable young viewpoint. Even Ace Combat 6 had, albeit a melodramatic, cheesy, sometimes annoying, but yes, grounded story in that of Ludmilla and Melissa. Even if the carry-through wasn't perfect, the attempt was correct. To put simply, we just don't have anything like that in Project Wingman. You can blow up a whole city and use a giant orange, oversaturated explosion, but if all you have to show for alternate perspective is a few mentions of civilians early on, and some geologists commenting on the devastation, it's fairly easy as the player and audience to remain detached. Ace Combat Zero has had multiple interviews, and an entire documentary frame of reference. It's a story about a war that's essentially done. What is breathing life into it is, the survivors and their impressions of Cypher, the player's actions, and its fantastically grounded point of emotional reference. Likewise, as Ace Combat's world is much closer to our own, the use of even a handful of nuclear weapons within their context is one we simply have more points of emotional reference with to connect to ourselves and our world. Zero's further grounding in the mid-90s historical allegory really helped enable a further emotional connection to events to be remixed into its version of history. The Suez Canal, the bombing of Dresden, the Yugoslav wars. One thing that this restart does cause, which Zero also suffers from a bit, is the fact that the very tight pacing has to stop and restart at this point. We have our big snowballing campaign of good pacing and build-up, and then has to stop, slow the car, go, wow, look at that car accident, and then speed up again. The return to Rousdower base really only shows impatience to keep the plot moving. It doesn't even have really the time to go, wow, what an impact. Within 2 missions, massive modern mechanized war with freaking land battleships has just returned. Which is cool, but you should see the point. If the audience is told, this bad thing is like the big bad thing, which, fucked everything, but the mechanics and the scale impact that it really has is negligible, it's hard to feel quite the same actual emotional impact. Ace Combat 7 had the similar issue with its penal unit missions largely lacking anything particularly penal about them. We subsequently get a very long cutscene audio drama about our current predicament. Conveniently enough, pretty much every major character survives this supposed cataclysm, which further robs solid impact. And here, to really round out the section, the core issues with the end of the campaign is what happens during the penultimate mission and final boss fight. We return to Presidia, to our focal point city. This is our big Farbanti or Grace Maria, only the issue is what happens at the end. Everybody explodes! Now, I don't know, maybe in Project Wingman 2, all the cast is revealed to be fine and alive, but as far as this game goes, all the characters get the axe. Hello, yes, I've just been made aware that if you beat the game on Mercenary, all of the cast is still alive. For what should be obvious reasons, this second survival of everyone who matters deflates the second big explosion, much like their survival deflates the first big explosion, and changes 0 of my points. And Crimson 1 becomes our final villain boss fight. Really, the best way to sum up both the fight and the character and the plot is, oh yeah, it ends with a lot of lights and noise, but mostly it just drags on a bit too long and isn't quite as impressive once you look past the flash. For 2 points, I feel this is a really weak ending. Firstly, for what characters we do get, Dip and Comet and Galaxy, none really do get a comprehensive arc or payoff. This was an issue I had with Ace Combat 5 and 7 as well. Characters show up, get a bit of development, but lack a fully realized arc. This is more akin to a slice of life than a meaty war plot with characters showing a lot of change. Gundam has tons of characters who go through rather significant development. Actually like dozens of characters across UC and AU at this point. Now I know. HAZE Combat's formula is a tough one to write for. Your time's limited, but it is possible. AC has Dijon, and my boy, my Ibo, Keith, and Marcus, my man, Shamrock, who did get, ironically, good, solid character arc despite the cheesy writing. Now I could forgive a lot of this, all these characters mostly there to orbit around the central character and antagonist, if those work. PJ, for example, is largely a human sacrifice in Zero for the plot, but as the core of Zero is actually Cypher and Pixie, it isn't necessarily a huge downside. Project Wingman does not have that benefit. I think maybe no character gets done dirtier and highlights this lack of a core better than Crimson One. And here, the reason I mentioned them in the beginning, the really volatile combination of A, boys be ambitious, and B, no cutscenes, is a rough one. With something like HAZE Combat's formula, the protagonist is already a write-off as a blank slate. But a good antagonist can balance that. Crimson One is not that. Already, Yellow 13 and Pixie had way more literal screen time. Yellow 13 gets the focus of the B-plot and the child story to really flesh out and show his progression as a nemesis to Mobius 1. As the main enemy Ace, he reoccurs mission by mission, building up his presence and whittling away at the Yellow's squadron's seemingly invulnerability alongside the player's progression. Here, already, Crimson One loses entirely out. He has zero cutscene time, which remember, also pulled double duty as the young boy's grounding emotional point of contact with the audience. Kind of a smart move there. So where Yellow 13 feels sympathetic like a good villain should be, Crimson is just an arrogant, talkative asshole. What's worse, the presence of Frost, while helping to flesh out the world, did cut into Crimson's potential limited screen time for development. When Crimson really only shows up in battle 4 missions, Frost's 2 battles could have added an entire third more time for Crimson's character. And oof, if we compare Crimson 1 to soloing Pixie, it just gets worse. But Arkenball, he talks about philosophy at you in a big final battle. Yes, and Pixie had the entire game, both within the pretense of his interviews and as your wingman and your buddy, to develop both his character and presence in the plot. Zero may have had, shorter side aces as well, but those were just extra side salads and fries around the big Larry Folk rotisserie chicken. And they still got their own interviews afterwards. So basically, our main antagonist is given the entire scope of HAZE Combat Zero's ambitious plot, or ideas or whatever, with less screen time than Yellow 13, let alone Pixie, with on top, no cutscenes to even further reduce the narrative time to develop his head character. So sorry, as tight as those first 14 missions are, the final arc doesn't land with anywhere near the same impact. It loses out in a lot of ways to alternatives that were less ambitious but more fleshed out, guillotines the rest of the cast's cataclysmic conclusion of characterization, and really lacked the execution needed to carry through on its up until then tight pacing and plot. So I know that sounds very critical, but I said I would be honest. Project Wingman is still, by percentage, mostly very good. As is, Project Wingman's story is nowhere near the worst. It might not be 3, 4, or 0, but it's definitely above 5, and it's way above fucking 7. I can still very well understand the intended thematic points about war at all costs. I think there are some good ideas in there for sure, even if the characters who are the vehicles for those ideas break down. I titled this review an HAZE Combat AU because much like a Gundam AU, it has many common elements derived from the source material, but also, just like many Gundam AUs, while it takes a lot from HAZE Combat, there are a lot of rough areas where the original series had great strength. All in all, there is still a lot to love. I found the railgun's visual effect, charge noise, and area of effect explosion great and very satisfying to use. The AOA limiter is, in my humble opinion, far and away superior to 7's canned post-stall moves, offering more dynamic movement to the player and freedom of expression with that mechanic. Conquest mode was also fun for overheating my GPU and turning the game into a bullet hell shooter. So yeah, some guys in a garage came together and made something. It's not perfect, but it gets a lot right. Considering their limitations, it's a very ambitious effort. With a bit of polish on those spots, they would easily go much further. Even if the story doesn't pan out to its desired heights, even if the graphic design is rough, Even if the mechanical bits are a bit rough around the edges, it's still quite good. It's an impressive indie achievement. It seems their future project, at least in some ways, hopes to address some of these shortcomings, which gives me a lot of hope. As for an actual Ace Combat game, and not an audio drama, with a little more work in the right places, a sequel could definitely rival the best of Ace Combat.